stop everything, because what you're about to hear sounds less like royal protocol and more like a calculated royal execution dressed up as tradition. Prince William has reportedly made a move so cold, so precise, that even seasoned palace insiders are whispering one thing behind closed doors: this was never about damage. Control, this was about power. Prince Harry isn't just being criticized anymore, he's being erased, repositioned, and quietly replaced. And the replacement? Not a rival prince, not a senior royal, but a 15-year-old boy. Let that sink in, because if this story feels unreal, that's exactly what makes it dangerous. The moment the news broke, it didn't trickle, it detonated. A legal strike, carefully wrapped in constitutional language, aimed directly at Harry's identity. Not whispers, not warnings, formal proceedings, documents, mechanisms that haven't been touched in over a century. The kind of machinery reserved for traitors, not brothers. And suddenly, every title, every privilege, every financial thread tied to Duke of Sussex was no longer Harry's. It was being redirected surgically toward James Earl of Wessex. But wait, why him? Why now? And why does this feel less like reaction and more like a plan that's been quietly waiting for its moment? Because when you start peeling back the layers, the timeline doesn't behave like a spontaneous crisis. It behaves like a trap, a long, patient setup, something that had already been mapped out long before Harry ever stepped onto Australian soil. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Let's talk about Australia. March 2026, Sydney. What was presented publicly as a private visit now looks more like a chain reaction of explosive missteps, 8 of them to be exact. 8 separate incidents that, when lined up, don't feel random at all. They feel like evidence, like someone was watching, documenting, waiting. First, the meeting. Quiet, unannounced, and deeply controversial. Harry sits down with Anthony Albanese inside Kirribilli House. 90 minutes. No clearance. No notification to the British government. No palace awareness. And what was discussed? Not small talk. Not charity. He allegedly positioned himself as a kind of unofficial envoy for Commonwealth relations. A freelance royal. A parallel voice. A shadow presence. And here's the unsettling part. This wasn't leaked immediately. It surfaced later, as if someone had been holding on to it. Then comes the security gap. 7 hours. 7 hours where Harry, still deeply tied to the royal structure, was effectively unprotected in a foreign country. No coordination with Australian authorities. No official oversight. Just silence. And in intelligence terms, silence is never just silence. Then money enters the picture. A $250,000 speaking fee, routed through layers. Questions about transparency start bubbling. Was it mismanagement or something more deliberate? Either way, it adds weight to a narrative that's already becoming dangerously heavy. And then the image. The moment that spread like wildfire. Harry appearing at a veterans event wearing military decorations he was no longer authorized to display. Not a small slip, not a wardrobe mistake. This was symbolism, identity. And when the Ministry of Defense reportedly labeled it unauthorized use of insignia, it stopped being emotional and became official. But here's where the tone shifts from questionable to explosive. Behind closed doors at a private dinner at the Australian National University, something was said, something Harry didn't expect to be recorded. And when that recording reached London, insiders didn't call it criticism, they called it undermining. Words about the monarchy being in managed decline. Words aimed not at a system, but at his own father, King Charles III. Think about that for a second. A son in a private room, speaking about his father's reign as if it's already failing. Was it honesty, frustration, or something far more dangerous in the eyes of the institution? Because from that moment on, everything starts to accelerate. Media narratives begin splitting. One version presenting Harry as a working royal, another insisting he's completely independent. 2 realities running side by side, and the palace? Quietly collecting receipts, screenshots, statements, building something that feels less like defense and more like prosecution. And then, this is the part no one can ignore, the meeting that insiders are now calling the point of no return. Harry meets with representatives of the Australian Republic movement. Let's be clear about what that means. A royal, engaging with a movement that openly questions and seeks to dismantle the monarchy itself. You don't need to be a constitutional expert to understand how that looks from inside the palace walls. And here's the chilling part. By the time all of this was happening, the groundwork for action may have already been in place, because evidence suggests that as early as late 2025, discussions had already begun. Legal frameworks explored, contingency plans drafted, quiet meetings held. Prince William wasn't reacting, he was preparing. So now the real question isn't just what Harry did. It's whether Harry walked straight into something that had been waiting for him all along. And if that's true, then this isn't just a fallout. It's a calculated shift in power, executed at exactly the right moment. And we haven't even reached the most unsettling part yet, because once you understand the legal machinery behind this move, the ancient laws being pulled from the shadows, the strategy of transferring a title instead of destroying it, you start to realize something much bigger is happening here. Something that doesn't end with Harry. Something that rewrites how this institution protects itself. And the deeper you go, the more it feels like this story is still unfolding. And just when you think this couldn't get more calculated, more deliberate, more chilling in its precision, the legal machinery behind this move begins to reveal itself. And suddenly, this isn't just family drama anymore. This is something far older, far colder, and far more strategic than anything we've seen in modern royal history. Because what Prince William has reportedly triggered isn't some improvised reaction. It's a resurrection, a revival of legal instruments that were never meant for casual use. We're talking about mechanisms buried so deep in constitutional history that most people assume they were relics, untouchable, forgotten, irrelevant. And yet, here they are being pulled into the light with surgical intent. The Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a law designed in wartime, a law used against those who sided with enemies of the crown, now being whispered in the same breath as Prince Harry. Let that echo for a moment, because whether you agree with it or not, the implication alone is explosive. It reframes everything. It transforms a family dispute into something that feels almost prosecutorial. Then there's the layered authority embedded within royal control itself, the idea that titles are not owned, not possessed, but held temporarily at the pleasure of the crown. And if that pleasure disappears, so does everything attached to it. The identity, the status, the power, gone, not erased, but reassigned. And that's the twist that turns this entire story into something almost surreal. Because this isn't just about taking something away, it's about giving it to someone else, directly, intentionally, without pause. The doctrine they're reportedly invoking, translation of honors, sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But strip away the language, and what you're left with is a blunt reality. One man's title doesn't vanish, it's handed over, like a baton, like a replacement. And in this case, that baton lands in the hands of James Earl of Wessex, a teenager who, until now, has lived almost entirely outside the storm. And that's where the emotional fault line opens up. Because while the institution calculates, while the lawyers draft, while the palace executes its strategy with ice-cold discipline, there's a 15-year-old boy at the center of. This who didn't ask for any of it. One day, he's living a relatively quiet life. The next, he's being positioned, whether he understands it or not, as the new face of a title that has been at the center of global controversy for years. Think about the weight of that. Think about the silence surrounding him. Because silence in moments like this doesn't feel peaceful. It feels loaded. And then zoom out again. Look at the timeline, not as isolated dates, but as a pattern. November 2025, conversations begin. December, strategic meetings. January, legal groundwork. Even a quiet alignment with political figures like Keir Starmer, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no resistance, no hesitation, no uncertainty. By the time Harry stepped into Australia in March 2026, was the decision already made? That's the question that keeps surfacing louder each time you look at the sequence. Because if the plan existed before the mistakes, then those mistakes weren't just incidents. They were triggers. And if they were triggers, then everything that followed starts to look less like justice and more like execution. Now consider what happens next, because this is where the tension doesn't resolve, it multiplies. Harry's response. Silence? That would be shocking. Acceptance? Almost unthinkable. Escalation? That's where things get dangerous. Because if he chooses to fight, legally, publicly, emotionally, this doesn't stay contained within palace walls. This spills out. Courtrooms, headlines, leaked documents, private communications dragged into the light, years of tension crystallized into evidence. And here's the uncomfortable truth: even if Harry loses in court, he could still win a narrative. Because the longer this plays out, the more the world watches, the more questions get asked, the more cracks, real or perceived, start to show. But if he doesn't fight, if he steps back, retreats, rebuilds his life entirely outside the royal structure, then something else happens. The separation succession becomes permanent, not just physical, but symbolic. Two branches of the same family moving in completely different directions with a history that can't be rewritten and a future that no longer overlaps. And somewhere in that future, there are children, Harry's children, who will grow up knowing that a title once tied to their father was taken and given to someone else. Not faded, not forgotten, taken. What does that do to a family story? What does that do to identity? These are the kinds of consequences institutions don't calculate easily because they don't show up in legal documents. They don't appear in financial statements. They live in memory, in perception, in resentment that doesn't fade with time. And then there's the bigger question, the one that sits quietly beneath all of this, waiting. What does this mean for the monarchy itself? Because if an heir, not even the reigning monarch, can orchestrate something this significant, this irreversible, then the power structure has already shifted, subtly but undeniably. Prince William isn't just preparing to lead, he's already acting, already shaping outcomes, already demonstrating a kind of authority that feels immediate. So where does that leave King Charles III? Authorizing? Yes. But driving? That's another question entirely. And questions like that don't just disappear. They linger, they build, they quietly reshape how people understand what's really happening behind palace doors. Because at its core, this isn't just about Harry. It's about control. It's about narrative. It's about an institution proving very publicly that it can still defend itself, even if that means turning its full weight against one of its own. And now we're at the edge of something unresolved. The Privy Council decision looms. Legal challenges hang in the air. Public opinion is shifting, forming, dividing. And behind all of it, there's a feeling, subtle but persistent, that this story hasn't reached its end. Because the move has been made. The title has been set in motion. The replacement is already in place. But the fallout, the reaction, the consequences that no one can fully predict, they're just beginning. And if you're paying attention, really paying attention, you'll notice something unsettling. The louder the headlines get, the quieter certain details become. And in stories like this, it's usually the quiet parts that matter most.